Hello and welcome to Narrative Drivetime, a show where we talk to storytellers about storytelling. I'm Craig Colby. I've produced shows on television for 30 years, executive producer, writer, director, all of those things. And that guy right there is one of the most celebrated authors in Canadian history. Science fiction writer Robert J Sawyer. He's won the Hugo Award, top award in science fiction, the Nebula Award, the John W. Campbell Award. He's a member of the Order of Ontario, the Order of Canada. And he has had a book of his made into an ABC television series, and that is Flash Forward. Robert, thank you so much for joining us today.
Craig, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And also, I should mention, just one of my favorite people to deal with in the business. Fascinating, smart things come out of his mouth all the time, and they're always great conversations. And I should start this by saying he has a new book out, The Oppenheimer Alternative, which I read and loved. And it's an interesting mix of a history book and a science fiction book, and also a personal interrelationship drama. It's about Oppenheimer and his peers in the Manhattan Project, and then it evolves to become something else. What is it about this group of people that fascinated you and made you want to write this book?
Well, when we look back from the far future at our past, there are only a few seminal events, and there are only two that we actually know the dates of. We don't know when fire was tamed. We don't know who invented the wheel, but we know who was responsible for us discovering the secrets of atomic energy. It was J. Robert Oppenheimer and his team at the Manhattan Project. And we know, referring to the photo behind you, when man first landed on the moon. Other than that, history might as well not exist in terms of specificity. So if you want to tell a historical tale, you might as well tell one about one of the key turning points, not just of our century, but really of the entire human race.
And you spent a lot of time, it wasn't what I expected. There was a lot of time spent with the personalities and the interrelationships. What grabbed you about that?
This is my 24th novel. So for the other 23, I was the author of the characters. I had made them up from whole cloth. Now, yes, bits and pieces any author takes from friends and acquaintances, but you mix and you match, you morph, and you end up with something that's totally fictitious in the end. In this particular case, every single character in the book was a real human being. And all of them, of course, they were at a turning point in history, and all of them were geniuses. Every one of them, in one way or another, was larger than life. And I found them just so incredibly fascinating to write about. There was a freedom to using these extravagant, flamboyant, real-life characters that I could not have had with made-up characters. With made-up characters, you go, come on, that guy, he's too brilliant. He had the perfect quip at just the right moment. He did something, come on. You just had him do that really stupid thing to advance the plot. No, Oppie really did that really stupid thing, and history changed because of it.
It's obvious one of the reasons you wrote this book, at least it seems to me, that the anniversary of the bomb came up. So that's a nice sales tie-in for something you're interested in already. But in our pre-interview, you said something that I haven't heard from a lot of creative people. You know exactly where your ideas come from. Where do your ideas for books come from?
I always start with just a topic, just something that I want to explore. And I'm very careful, if I have a preconception about that topic, to set it aside. So for the Oppenheimer Alternative, my topic was the moral obligations of scientists. Well, as soon as you ask yourself about that, you start looking at scientists in the past who have dealt with things that have had enormous moral ramifications. We just observed in great solemnity the 75th anniversary of the bombing and deaths of 80,000 people in Hiroshima, Japan. And 3 days later, 50,000 or more in Nagasaki, Japan. This was scientists doing something that they felt at the time they undertook it, either one was morally neutral, two was just worth doing because science is always worth doing, or three was actually a moral imperative. They had to do it. And one by one, each of those positions became less and less tenable for these people. But I had my topic, the moral responsibility of scientists. My theme that I developed was, the world would be a heck of a lot better off if the brightest people in the world, whether it's our scientists, our engineers, our greatest doctors, didn't do the things the stupidest people, meaning our warmongers, want them to do, because the stupid people can't do it on their own. And if the bright guys said, yeah, I know you want a doomsday weapon, but come on, only an idiot would give that to a child, right?
So, well, boy, your timing
protest.
Your timing couldn't have been better on that topic.
Well, and I started with this 4 years ago. So
yeah,
the paradigm that was in the back of my mind obviously wasn't COVID-19 and the ridiculously ineffectual response of the American government, and the very clear cut, here's the scientist, there's Dr. Anthony Fauci, and as long as he's saying what the government wants to hear, he's the greatest genius of all time. As soon as he says anything that is against or not helpful to their pro-business agenda, then he becomes a pariah. But that obviously, when I started this 4 years ago, I knew who Fauci was. He had that position 4 years ago. And anybody like me and like you who lived through SARS in Toronto always has our ear to the ground for news about infectious diseases. But Trump obviously wasn't a factor. What was a factor was climate change. What was a factor really for the last 20 odd years in my consciousness, and 10 at least in general public consciousness, and going right back, 60 years now to Silent Spring and Rachel Carson, published that book in 1960, is the notion that we are, through human activities, altering the climate, altering our environment in precipitous ways, and the fact that we don't listen to the experts, or we seek out the one outlier amongst the experts who will gainsay, right? Get 100 guys on this side and one guy on that side, and you say, so it's 50-50. There either is or there isn't. No, it's 100 to 1.
Yeah, we definitely live in the golden age of selective perception.
Of selective perception, that's right. And so this absolutely thematically was the resonance. I wanted the Oppenheimer crew, the Manhattan Project scientists, to face again an existential crisis, an environmental one. It's a different one in my novel than global warming, but and give them a chance to seek out the redemption that they never got for what they wrought on all of us for the last 75 years. I said to my nieces, maybe 10 years ago, you guys are lucky. We all grew up, you, me, everybody who's our age or older, with the specter of nuclear annihilation. And I say, it's done. The Soviet Union has fallen. We don't have to worry about that anymore. Well, guess what? Soviet Union is resurgent in the new Russia and Vladimir Putin. Its cohort exists still in North Korea, and soon terrorists, just disenfranchised terrorists, will have atomic weapons as well. So my nieces have every bit as much to fear as the duck and cover generation of the 1950s had to fear.
Now, you said you had the topic you wanted to explore because it's, pretty scientifically prevalent. How did you get down to the nuts and bolts of the story?
Well, let me take an example of my penultimate book, the Quantum Night, because that I wasn't constrained by the facts of history. So the topic was simply, why are we bad? Why is there evil in the world? I'm a science fiction writer, so you ask the question, what is the science of evil? What scientific explanations are there for evil? You just pump that into a search engine. Well, as soon as you do that, what do you come up with? You come up with psychopathy, the study of psychopaths. You come up with Stanley Milgram and his famous obedience to authority shock machine experiments that said that people would keep cranking up electric shocks. Now, it was fake. The people weren't really being shocked, but the people being tested did not know that. And you also immediately come up with Philip Zimbardo, who 10 years later did the Stanford prison guard experiments. You immediately realize, okay, the guys who are most interested in this are experimental psychologists. They're also, both of them, by the way, were the children of Jews who had escaped Hitler's Holocaust. In other words, they were fascinated by the question of how any nation, Germany, could turn on a dime to become from being the great center of arts, culture, opera, science, literature that it was in the 1930s to being the most evil state that the world had ever seen till that point in the 1940s. So from top down, topic, how come we're evil? Question, is there any science of evil? And then my theme was the most pernicious lie. You develop a theme out of this. And what's the most pernicious lie we've ever told ourselves is you can't change human nature. On the negative side, Adolf Hitler proved you can. You can change it on a dime. You can take intelligent, well-educated, well-fed, prosperous population and turn them into mass murderers, just like that. And I wanted to say on the flip side, we can also change on a dime and go from any down point to being back to being decent people again. And we have to harness that for positive purposes. Out of that, my character had to be an experimental psychologist, obviously, because that's what comes up when you look into these questions of evil. Somebody who had been involved with atrocities in the past and been unaware of it, and so on and so forth. It develops organically from topic to theme, to thematic statement, to a character that lets you explore that thematic statement.
So you start with the idea. I've read
not even the idea, just the topic,
just a topic,
then the idea.
So
because if you start with the idea, you can't change human nature. That's all you're going to find, right?
Yeah.
Confirmation bias. You've got to, even if you think you know, you've got to say, and I make a point every single day, without needing to reveal in this interview what my own political leanings are, of reading our conservative and our liberal media in Canada, because they have different perspectives. The facts presumably are the same, but no, some facts are completely ignored by one side. Other facts are selectively chosen by the other side. So you have to go in with doing everything you can to be that, as Steven Pinker would call it, blank slate. And then, only then, I think, can you be on any kind of journey towards narrative truth.
And I think that's one of the great takeaways for people who are doing their own communication. And I've seen it even out in the field with reporters who've gone out to do one story, and they're going to do that story whether it's there or not. Because otherwise they don't get to file an expense claim. Otherwise they don't get a byline. Well, and just to put a classic example on it, remember Politan had their commercial that went viral in a very negative way last Christmas. They had the beautiful, fit wife who received as a Christmas present from her husband workout equipment, and she just goes and they thought, they obviously had tested it with their staff, with their focus groups, and because you don't air a commercial on national television without testing, and it blew up in their face because they had assumed that everybody, even those who are already fit and good looking and healthy, want to improve their circumstance and will take it as a compliment to be given exercise equipment. How much confirmation bias went on in their process. And they created this cute little story, and it's only 60 seconds, the commercial, with an appealing pair of actors in them, but it went completely wrong. The message that they thought they were sending was completely opposite of the message they actually sent, because they went in with their narrow blinders on about what the story actually is. So for anybody who's doing any type of writing that involves research, it's always a good idea to do the research first and take your cues from that.
Absolutely. And read the guys. I had my dent. Okay, I will come clean. I'm a liberal. My dentist,
didn't take long.
Retired, was a conservative, right? But he loved my science fiction. He loved my books. And we would argue and have great conversations. And he sent me a note when he heard I was writing about the Manhattan Project. He said, well, you should read Bill O'Reilly's book, Killing the Rising Sun, where he says we had to bomb the Japanese. And I wrote back, and I think this surprised him, and I said, I read it. Of course I read it. Of course I read everything the quote-unquote other side had to say too, because I had to understand their position. If I was, even if I was going to critique it, I had to not be knocking down straw men. I had to know what they were actually saying. And so many storytellers fail to look at, the fundamental thing they'll tell you in any creative writing class is all stories are about conflict in some way or another. Somebody wants something and they can't get it. Somebody wants to be president. Somebody else wants to be president. Somebody wants to end global warming. Somebody else wants to keep making money. Whatever it is, there's a conflict at the heart of any story. You got to find out what the conflict is and understand both sides of the conflict if you're actually going to tell the story as opposed to producing a marketing or a propaganda piece.
Well, you've hit on one of the big things that I've been preaching on in communication lately is, I've been in places where they said, well, our company has communication problems. And so they decided they needed to talk more. And actually, that wasn't it. They needed to listen more.
Yes.
Lead with your ears is always a really great place to start any conversation.
Absolutely. I didn't mean to interrupt. It wasn't like I wasn't listening. But this is what that Me Too reckoning has all been about is, suddenly men like you and me, I mean, not that we were offenders in this, but men throughout the world are finally being told, just shut up and listen to how your comments make us feel, or how your actions, or you may have great fun. You may think when you go into a meeting and, you dominate the room, that you've shown your prowess and you're advocating for your team and your position, but you're disenfranchising, you're shutting out, you're keeping people who are disinclined to play that game from feeling like they're welcome at the table. So Me Too has been this huge cultural shift. Now, whether it lasts, we have to wait and see. But at the moment, the message you just underscored, Craig, which is you got to listen before you talk. You've got to hear and take in before you have anything worthwhile to synthesize and give out.
I'm going to give you one little sidebar on that with a former boss of mine who I invited to. We'd have these story meetings where we would show bits of programming and have people talk about it. And my person I reported to naturally went first. And I talked to this person I reported to afterwards and said, listen, don't talk first. Because when you talk first, people are going to be afraid to disagree with you. Ask people their opinion first, and ask for the opinion of the intern or the researcher, the person who is lowest on the totem pole in the room. And that way you're going to get the feedback that you want rather than just shutting it down at first. Let
me respond to that with two examples. First, I didn't invent this technique, a very common technique of teaching short story writing or novel writing. You have a workshop, it's a round table, and everybody reads all the manuscripts in advance. Everybody goes around the circle in turn and gives their feedback. There are three major rules that we adhere to. One is the person getting the feedback, the author of the story, literally has to sit on his or her hands. Can't speak during the feedback, can't try to say, oh, but what I was trying to do was, no. Just listen. Just take it in. And indeed, at many of these kinds of workshops, you actually give them a teddy bear. So they got something to clutch. They got to do something to keep themselves quiet. The second rule is it moves around the table. The first story, person at the 12 o'clock position speaks first. And then the second story, the 1 o'clock, and you work your way around so that there never is a hierarchy of this guy always goes first. And the third rule is the instructor, me in that case, goes last for exactly the reason you said. Because if you go first, you have already told the room what the answer should be. And this is this classic failing of politicians. Or one could argue George Lucas as a storyteller, when he was responsible to 20th Century Fox and making the original 3 Star Wars movies, which we now call episode 4, 5, and 6. He was responsible to the studio and he had to kowtow. By the time those had become so incredibly successful, and he made the prequels, episode 1, 2, and 3, he didn't have to answer to anybody. And anybody who might have said to him, Jar Jar Binks is not the best idea you've ever had, was not even at the table to say that anymore, right? It's confirmation bias in storytelling. And you always have to be receptive. People will say to me, well, what if your editor doesn't like what you did? Great, tell me. For God's sakes, let me know before I make a fool out of myself in front of all my readers. And now I may or may not agree with the editor after we've talked about it. The editor may or may not hold on to that opinion that she or he had originally after we talk about it. But for God's sakes, let's talk about it while it's still malleable.
And have the people you listen to. I always thought that, Lennon and McCartney needed Lennon and McCartney.
That's
Who's going to tell
right.
Paul, I don't like those lyrics? Nobody.
Absolutely.
I wouldn't.
That exactly.
I shouldn't
Exactly.
personally,
And
but-
you see that all the time, these great partnerships. And then when each of them become, and I don't mean the Beatles here, but Lewis and Martin, the comedians, any number of people, each of them ultimately starts to think that they're the genius in the group. And then they break up and they go solo. And yes, you can say, okay, well, Simon maybe was the genius in Simon and Garfunkel, but vanishingly few examples actually work of the one guy going off on his own, because it is a dialogue. Everything we do is a left brain, right brain dialogue in ourselves, and as you and somebody else, you and your first audience, your first reader, your collaborator. It always is more effective that way.
Well, every good writer has a good editor. And my dad, who's a scientist, says the peer review process is saving you from yourself. I want to move on to a different topic that we talked about earlier in the pre-interview. What are the challenges of writing science fiction as opposed to anything else?
So for science fiction, you have to do everything else: character, plot, theme, dialogue, suspense, humor, romance, everything. Plus, you're taking on the one field of endeavor that we tend to think of as being super hard. People, I don't understand science. I don't know how the sun works. I don't know what gravity. People will say this all the time as if that's a perfectly reasonable thing to say, that they don't understand how the world works at a fundamental level. So we've inculcated a whole generation of people that really are science averse and science ignorant. And when you're writing science fiction, you have to, it's that spoonful of sugar that makes the medicine go down if the science is perceived of as the medicine. You have to make it fascinating, entertaining, and enjoyable. And if you tell somebody, okay, I know you don't know anything about computer science, but let me propose that we live in a simulation. You say, oh, no, we don't. So, well, let me tell you why. And here's why what we see in our real world shows signs of being just like a pixel array that's on your screen, making this graphic that you're looking at right now, whoever's looking at this right now there. Three-dimensionally instead of two-dimensionally, much finer pixels, but we can do experiments that show that actually there's a granularity, a quantum nature to our universe that suggests that maybe it is nothing more than an informational array. Oh, I didn't know that. So maybe I'm not real. Maybe the Truman Show was right. Yes, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the philosophy. You ease them into it like that. But once you get somebody on an interesting idea, they will follow the steps with you as long as you make them digestible, entertaining, and not the whole purpose of the exercise. We have a term in science fiction called the info dump, an indigestible or undigestible page after page section of merely explaining stuff with no character development, no conflict, no action, no wit, no humor. Info dump. It's like any kind of dump. As soon as it's over, you want to flush it and never see it again.
So you have to do all the regular storytelling things, plus all the science on top of it, and make the science enjoyable.
That's right. Now, all of that said, I'm 30 years a novelist now, and I was an early adopter of being online. I've had an email address since 1983. But most people really didn't get seriously online for the last decade or maybe 15 years or so. And it's only in that frame of time, half of my 30-year writing career, where everybody has understood that in their pocket, they have a device like this one right here that they can use at any time to find out anything at all that humanity knows now or has ever known in the past. So it used to be, if I wanted to talk about a very common notion in science fiction and in real physics, the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which suggests that every time a decision is made or every time an action is observed, all the possible realities really come into being, but in parallel universes. That's expository, what I just gave you there. But I can actually write now in a work of fiction, that just is like, it's the many worlds interpretation. We're in a parallel reality. And leave it at that. I couldn't do that 30 years ago. The book, the paper book, had to be self-contained. But now that you're just as likely to be reading the book on your computer or on your phone or on a device that has connectivity, as long as I embed the correct search terms, you can go and look it up. Just as you would look up, I read a lot of British fiction. And I just finished reading a book set in New Zealand. That was fascinating because there were references to New Zealand politics, New Zealand slang, terms I'd never heard in my life. And I just looked them up and moved on. And that's no different than, I've never heard of quantum chromodynamics. Oh, now I know what that is. Enough to get along with the story and move on to the next page.
What do you think the value is of science fiction?
So we live in a world where every one of our moral conundra is driven by science and technology. Let me give you a classic example. Back in the 1920s and 30s and even 40s and 50s, the central defining difference between the liberal part of the American politic and the conservative part was not the abortion debate. The abortion debate was essentially, I don't want to say a non-issue. I don't want to minimize women's reproductive freedom in any way, shape, and form. It was something that was always regrettable because no matter whether you felt you deserved it or not, there was no clean, safe, reliable, insurance-covered way to get it. So it was always the stuff of back rooms or back alleys, right? Then, lo and behold, comes the 1960s. And what does it give us? It gives us clean, safe abortions. It gives us the birth control pill. It gives us now also the morning after pill, the way to prevent a fertilized egg from implanting in the uterine wall and thereby ending the pregnancy. Those are science and technological advances. And suddenly the heart and soul of our debate in between the left and the right, you call it the abortion debate, is a debate over that. The debate over capital punishment in many measures comes down to, it used to be, there's no question, Jesus Christ died by capital punishment, and it was a horrific, horrible torture. Whether or not you're Christian or not, you know the story. Right, the guy is nailed to a cross and left to die in the hot Mediterranean sun. Oh, right now we can kill a guy with a chemical cocktail, and it's not cruel and unusual punishment. It's not hanging by the neck, which only works X number of times. It's not chopping off the head and having the head, which doesn't die instantaneously, look and see its body with the blood spurting out of the carotid arteries still. It's, there's nothing cruel and unusual about it. So is it ethical? Every time we come to an ethical or moral conundrum, it's because science and technology has given us a new, previously reserved only to the gods, power. And science fiction is the literature that deals with not just the first order, but the second and third order effects on society and on human beings of changes in science and technology.
Well, Robert, I could talk to you forever about these things. The two takeaways that I think for anybody who's looking at this for storytelling tips are, like, go into the research open-minded, and you will find things you hadn't thought of before. And that's just good advice for anybody listening to anybody. And you don't have to explain everything anymore, because people can go get it. It's not like I've got this book and there's miles to the library or to my neighbor's house. Everything is available to you now. And among the everything that's available to you now is the Oppenheimer Alternative. Can't recommend it enough. I loved it. Robert, thank you very much for spending some time with me today.
Craig, my pleasure. Anytime for you.
Happy to hear it. Thank you. Are you a storyteller who wants to tell the story of how you tell stories? Yes? Then I want to hear from you. Drop me a line at craig@colbyvision.net and tell me a little bit about yourself, your career, and some of the particulars of your process. Colbyvision is a storytelling company working in the broadcasting and the business world. Send me an email if you need help with either. Thanks to Tim Vesely for the music, and Kevin Francisco for the graphics, and Dave White for the editing. And thanks to you for watching Narrative Drive Time.